And the problem with perfectionism, it's the enemy of the good.
Yeah, that's true.
True.
That's true.
Well, it's the enemy of accomplishing anything.
Yeah.
But we've got cameras, we've got stuff going on.
Why don't you let me start while you meditate on that?
Good idea.
Yeah. Anna, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Very, very pleased to meet you. I have seen some of your work, and I'm hugely impressed. And the reason why I say this is I've been watching millennials and Gen Z, and I've been wondering what their take is on many of the things that are going on now. One big question is the stuff that's going on campus, where I see young women draped in keffirs, coming out and saying, it's of course anti-Jewish and they think they're pro-Palestine, but don't they know what Hamas does to women and has done to women? Can you please explain that to me? I just don't get it. I'm mystified.
I absolutely cannot explain it because I don't understand it myself. I think that they don't really think that far, like what Hamas is, what radical Islam is. These are young people, so they're naturally left-leaning because I think things like protest and activism give them a social occasion, an occasion to socialize. And I think it helps them get the lead out. And, it's like, I think young people in general are drawn to leftism because it gives them an outlet for violence, for violent feelings.
Yeah.
And for horniness and horny feelings. So, my impression is that these are very coddled, sheltered American middle-class kids. Maybe some of them have immigrant backgrounds, but they grew up with a sort of silver spoon in their mouth and they're kind of slumming and LARPing. I know that's a very unfashionable, controversial thing to say because you're basically diminishing the Palestinian cause. But of course, they don't know anything about the Palestinian cause, even though maybe they have keynotes of talking points and they've learned the history, I'll grant that, and they believe that they believe. Yeah. But they're so fundamentally divorced from the reality of this basically ancient biblical fraternal conflict.
Yes. And that then brings me to the question which normally one starts with, which is how come you are different? Can you give me a little bit of your background? Were you born and raised here, or did you come from elsewhere? Because you have this perceptive, I'd say, analysis, judgment, which many of your peers either lack or they're too frightened to come out and say what you're saying.
Yeah, so just to give you guys the TLDR, I was born in Moscow, Russia, back when it was the Soviet Union. I came to the United States with my family when I was 5. My father is an academic and my mother is a housewife. And I moved to New York about 15 years ago to go to grad school for art history. Yeah. But I think basically, I'll just repeat what I told you guys off the record. We just had Steve Saylor on our podcast, and he mentioned that he was adopted as a young child, and his parents never hid this from him, and they were always very upfront about it. And, I told him then that I have to think that him being adopted, him feeling like he was an outsider, had some distance, was what got him on the path to noticing. Yeah. And I think that probably me being an immigrant coming here at a pivotal moment, at the moment when Freud says your memories start to form, around the age of 4 or 5, had to have influenced the fact that I've always felt somewhat divorced from kind of the status quo or the consensus from the masses. And I've always had this compensatory impulse because I desperately want to be a normie, but I just can't make it happen. And I remember, growing up in New Jersey in the 90s, and it was a very multicultural, colorblind society. We were, when we came here, we were poor, we were pretty low income, like all Russian immigrants are. And I've always put my childhood drawings on social media because they're such a obvious early act of noticing from like an innocent child's mind that doesn't know what's going on or what they're doing.
Yeah.
But it is basically like honest and objective impression of reality.
And do you think that that reality is sort of reinforced by comparison? Obviously, you go home, you talk to your parents who have a very different maybe view of the world, or they've come from the Soviet Union, or everything's just slightly different, and then you're comparing it to America.
Yeah, I just think you know, to quote something Steve said again, that the reality generally conforms with your personal observations, not what fashionable opinion or establishment opinion is trying to say or trying to tell you. It doesn't really conform with kind of like the dogmas, the social justice, like liberal dogmas of our time.
Yeah. Do you think that there is a flight from reality? In some of these conversations, there are all these ideas and ideologies and what people think society would look like if they got what they wanted. And so one of the things that I find striking about just gazing at these conversations take place and these confrontations is the language first, the label, liberalism, looking at organizations and movements that are seeking illiberal ends and seeking to end freedom. And the more I look at this, the more I think it's not just the ideologues who are twisting reality, twisting language, taking the world upside down. But those of us who are reacting to it, we're also going along with it. We're calling them, for instance, liberals. And I think, let's pause. What does that, you just call them liberals, but they're not liberals. You call them progressives, but they're not progressives. Another one is pro-Palestine. And I look at the kids in Palestine, in Gaza. It really, I feel nauseated that they're used as human shields. But we just adopt their language, and there's this. Then you get this communal flight from reality. They're the ideologues, and we who are just watching and reacting to it. We're all using their language, and I wonder if you see that, and how, like, where is. Where's the grown-up among these people who says, hey, just call it, quit this. This isn't real. This is a pretense. We're pretending that we're freedom fighters. We're pretending that we're fighting for a cause. Like, what is this?
I don't know. I find it very difficult to understand, to answer why there is like this conceptual leap between reality as it really is versus reality as people want it to be or expect it to be in their utopian ideal. And there is this like very strong mechanism in culture now that's probably existed throughout time but seems to exist very strongly now, that involves basically kind of willfully lying to yourself about certain kind of real observable phenomena and forcing everybody else to bear witness. It's the forcing everybody else to bear witness. It's the hostage crisis that really grinds my gears.
So what degree do you think that's sort of a form of like narcissism? Basically, like in these movements, I'm thinking of that lady who was begging for humanitarian aid outside of Columbia University a few days ago.
I miss that. I try to. I'm like a emu or an ostrich. I like have not been following the protests because they're just like aesthetically irritating to me. And I am like at the end of the day, like in my own private moments, like a huge social justice warrior and bleeding heart liberal. So I feel very bad about the children of Gaza who are suffering because I have a 3-year-old and he kind of looks like them. It's the narcissism of small differences. Like I can identify with with them and their cause. And I don't like that being used by both sides as like a kind of a pawn or a shield.
Just on that, like, I just wanted to sort of like go a little bit deeper. There was something one of our sort of friends mentioned recently, basically about this sort of counterintuitive combination between like submission and rebellion in like a lot of activist movements, where these guys are essentially sort of LARPing as rebels, defiant sort of figures on the college campus, but they're sort of completely gung-ho for the dogma of the day. And then, Ayan, I wondered whether you recognize that sort of combination in the radical Islam that you've experienced.
Yeah, in radical Islam I understand it because I grew up within that political ideology. But what the Islamists try and do is they don't deny reality. They just say the reality you live in is bad and it's wrong. And so you, as a Muslim, you need to become a good Muslim. You need to reshape that reality. And by describing exactly the reality you live in, so if you're a woman, they say, look, your life right now is miserable because you're longing for things. And then they give you a list of the things that you're longing for, which is real. And then they say, that's all haram. It's forbidden. It takes you away from faith in God. And so together, let's reshape it and give you a purpose for it. So in many ways, I find it much more interesting and much closer to the ground, more organic.
More honest, maybe.
And more honest in many ways. If you actually, right now you see them all over Twitter, Islamists being really honest. A few years ago, they were afraid of being arrested, so they weren't being honest. But right now, they're very, very honest. It's much more honest than, say, the Me Too movement, where I look at these women all organized and dressed up and saying, oh, social change, we've changed everything. They haven't changed anything. They don't look like they understand what they are saying. I don't know. I'm now all over the place, but I remember when Trump became president, there were all these women who went out to protest against Trump's attitude to women. But go back, look at those visuals.
Is totally healthy, by the way.
Look at those visuals and listen to them, and you think, what is your cause? What are you marching for? And when you try to answer that question, it's all over the place. Some were there for climate, some were there for, there was women with headscarves and they were there for Gaza and Palestine. There were others for, so here, there, everything. It was just that kind of like.
I used to know a friend who lived with this lady who kept a series of placards just right by the front door. And when she was going out on one of her protests, she would sort of filter through them and pick out whichever one she wanted that day. And they were all different causes. Some of it was climate, some of it was
Quentin Crisp, you guys mentioned,
we get to
had that great line that like the young have to find a way to rebel and conform at the same time, and the way that they solve for that is by rebelling against their elders and conforming with their peers. And I think obviously that's what's going on. The big problem, I think, in our society is that the kind of dominant hegemonic worldview is driven by left liberal concerns and causes, and those are the causes of progress. And progress is never ending. Once you wrap one cause up, you have to move on to the next one because there are jobs, livelihoods, egos on the line. You can't just pack up and go home. And so you go from like gay marriage to transgender to God knows what else is coming around the bend. So I think that's part of why everything feels kind of like a grab bag of incoherent ideas. The Me Too feminists specifically, and feminists in general, have this idea that women who have a more normative view of, let's say, like sex roles and gender relations and their own desires are suffering from a false consciousness that's imposed on them by kind of men or the patriarchy. But of course, they never stop to ask themselves whether they're suffering from a false consciousness of their
or whether
own.
they're suffering at all.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point.
Yeah. So on the gender thing, the big, when I came to the West, this was in 1992, the big themes were women getting equal pay,
right,
and it was childcare, and it was shattering the glass ceiling. These were all very concrete, very material things. And have those things been achieved, A? B, if they have been achieved, then what's the point of feminism?
That's a good question. I think that they absolutely have been achieved in the advanced developed West. The causes of like suffrage and economic equality are, I think have been, the fights for those causes have been successful. It strains the credulity. I struggle to think what the purpose of feminism is in this day and age. I think feminism and anti-racism are kind of part and parcel of the same thing. As I said on the Dissident Dialogues panel, that the big problem, the issue is that when you remove the kind of cultural constraints and social guardrails that keep the sexes and the races artificially separated, what ends up happening is that the kind of innate biological differences between them become much more obvious. And neither feminism nor anti-racism really has an answer for that. The way they solve for it is kind of doubling down on blaming more, blaming what has historically supposedly ailed us, like men and the patriarchy in the case of feminism, or systemic structural racism in the case of like BLM. And I think it becomes, on the one hand, a very purposeless and destructive force, these kind of social justice movements. But on the other hand, they're very important and entrenched because they do give this professional activist class it's a jobs program. Yeah. So it has a pragmatic, realistic reason to exist.
Yeah. But if we restore sort of the healthy attitude of women, sorry, I have to get this, because what I see with those three things, childcare, shattering the glass ceiling, sort of economic equality is, there are no barriers to women on those three things. And then you get these statistics. My friend Christina Somers questions the veracity of the statistics, but she says, look at all of these positions of power, CEOs. We've never had an American female president. And so this testifies to the fact that actually we are saying that these things have been attained, but we are not quite there yet. There's that story. But the other story is, I, as a woman with a university degree, seeing no obstacles in front of me in the economic market, choose not to become a CEO, but I choose to stay at home with my children and raise them with my husband. That story, that's the story, amazingly, that true feminists have become hostile to.
Right.
And I wonder how that affects you. I know how it affected my generation, but how does it affect your generation and those beyond? I mean, do you see yourself as, it's something about having this status. If you're a woman, you have the status of CEO, is that a fulfilling, satisfying feeling versus knowing you could be a CEO if you wanted, and you say, no, I don't want to be a CEO. I'd rather actually be at home with, and you just make a different choice. You have the freedom to choose.
I think every single woman I know who has had children has basically made that choice and landed on the side of children and family. Kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, it's very clear that the great success, the triumph of feminism in the West has basically forced women to confront what are essentially their own biological limitations,
Yes.
and that you can't solve for that without giving women as a class, special pleading, special concessions to bump them up to the level of men.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a feminist issue. It's not a social issue. It's simply a fact of life. It's a biological
It is biological
thing.
Yeah.
And I think that, we as women, basically, not only do we not face any impediments except for biological ones
Mm-hmm.
in our kind of milieu, in our class, but in fact, I think we have quite a bit of privilege compared to like white straight men, especially
Yeah.
at this point,
Yeah.
which is, an interesting curiosity and something that feminism cannot fundamentally grapple with, because it sort of makes the feminist cause completely, it lays it bare as completely, at this point, I don't want to say that...
Anti-woman.
Yeah, false.
Yeah, it is anti-woman. I think what I'm getting at is the choice bit, which is even if I can defy biology, which some women do by saying, I'm not going to get married, or find a male partner who will look after the children. Mm-hmm. So she'll have a child and then still end up having a great career. Mm-hmm. Even for women who make those choices, it is, we admire them. Mm-hmm. I know they have this societal stature. Mm-hmm. But I want to get back to, why are women or the feminist movement hostile to the women who choose something else, knowing they have no obstacles? That is, I think, where it grinds the most. Mm-hmm. It is as if they want to say the story of feminism was that we all go up the career ladder. Mm-hmm. But some of us are saying, sorry, I don't want to. Mm-hmm. And then the women who do that are paid less, yes, it's a choice, and or are just not considered emancipated.
Mm-hmm. Why? That's a good question. I don't know if I have the answer to it. I mean, I would say because they suffer from a false consciousness, because they are in denial about their own desires and their own biology.
Yeah.
And I'm not like in the business of issuing predictions, but what I suspect is going to happen is that there's going to be a paradigm shift among women in their late 20s to early 40s who are like the breadwinners of the family, and the men are essentially house husbands, or they like sit, couch potato gamer type guys who stay at home and watch the kids while the woman brings home the bacon. Yeah. I see that already happening in my friend group.
So the men and the women are the breadwinners.
Yeah, of
and
course.
How do they respond?
Well, it creates a new sources of friction and frustration, obviously, that again are unsolvable. They're intractable because they are a biological issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who are becoming lawyers. A lot of my female friends who are sort of trying to find Mr. Right, and the pool of men they are like hoping to go for is sort of vanishingly small, and they get smaller and smaller every single time they go up.
Yeah, because I think
tax bracket.
In the traditional kind of paradigm of male-female relations, being a successful man is a value add, but being a successful woman is not necessarily a value add. It's not something that men necessarily look for or go for, which is its own separate problem. But I see this a lot, women getting themselves house husbands or coupling with younger men. Mm-hmm. I think this is already like here to stay.
I see a few years ago, I think it was in The Economist, there was a very long article about women in South Korea and in Singapore. And they were successful women, professional women, and they were not marrying, not choosing mates from these men who were eligible, but not, the women's income and education was higher than that of the men. Mm-hmm. And again, I think it's a biological thing that women want to mate with a male with a higher status.
Right.
And so there was all these unmarried women, childless, and all these frustrated men who couldn't find women. And so that society then ended up still struggling with, and then they had also the attitude towards girls. There's a lot of aborting of baby girl fetuses because it's a big cultural prejudice there that they have against girls. And so a society that found itself in this decline of fertility. And it's very hard to come back from that. And I wonder if something along those lines is happening to our modern Western societies.
Yeah, I think so, though. I think like traditionalists and right-wingers love to blame feminism for the state of affairs. And I don't think that's necessarily entirely true. I think you have to look at progressivism as a whole, and you have to look at technology, how much of this is ideological versus technological. If you look at the countries hardest hit by the fertility crisis, they are overwhelmingly the rich developed Asian countries. So Japan, South Korea, now China is headed for a demographic cliff, allegedly. Their statistics are actually worse than those in America and Europe. And they don't have a particularly strong feminist tradition.
No.
So I guess that's like pushing back maybe slightly on this idea that the sexual revolution has caused all of this dysfunction. Maybe, I suppose, the sexual revolution doesn't really seem to be fully fledged in China or South Korea, or is it?
Yeah, I think that they probably always traditionally, I don't know enough about Asian culture to really opine authoritatively on this, but I think that they probably just always had more parity and like less dimorphism between the sexes to begin with.
Yeah.
And they were early adopters of like technological advances. But I don't know. It seems like this is a problem that goes beyond feminism. Israel, on the other hand, I think you could make a case that it's a more feminist country, but they've always had more or less robust above replacement birth rates. It looks like it's going down now, even among the Orthodox, who are like the driving population behind the high birth rates. But even educated middle-class secular women from Ashkenazi backgrounds in Israel, I believe, still have an above replacement birth rate.
Even modern women in Arab Muslim countries, there is a fall in birth rates, not as much and not as dramatic as in Western countries and some of these Far Eastern countries, but there is a drop.
Yeah, and
so technology, you do have a point with if you can, family plan. And family planning is an offer. Most societies tend to take it.
Yeah, and I know this is like more your wheelhouse than mine. But obviously my fear, I guess, or my hunch with the Islamic world was less that the radical Islamism would be exported to the West. So that's certainly true and happening. It's that they would kind of experience the same kind of crisis of like anomie and malaise that befalls the West at a later date. And that's sort of like, I think, what Welbeck probably got wrong in Submission.
Yeah.
Because, he recently gave an interview, I think in 2023, where he talked about how all of the, he was obviously widely billed, accused of being like a racist and an Islamophobe for that book. And his position was always like, no, I have a begrudging respect for Islam because they're the only society now that can offer a model for marriage. Yeah. Which is what most cultural and religious efforts throughout time have basically been marshaled toward. It's like
I think he thought that faith, in submission, I read Submission, and there's, the Catholic figure, he tries to go to the Catholic Church. And I think his conclusion is probably, well, that's dead. Catholicism in France is dead. But I think it's not I think Christianity is not dead, maybe re-emerging.
Well, I mean, it just feels like probably Muslims, at least in the West, are headed for a reality where they're consumers and internet addicts like the rest of us, not much in the way of religious radicals.
Well, it is that is a little bit of head in the sand, because again, there are two groups of Muslims. There are Muslims who are not activists, and they're peace-loving. They're not political, and yes, their birth rates are comparable to those of other groups. And then you have those activists, Muslims, who really want to dominate. And part of their activism for how to spread Sharia law and dominate is you get married early, you get as many babies as you can, you bring your relatives in. So there's sort of a planned takeover using demographics and fertility.
Yeah, I mean, they're smart. They have the right idea.
They have the right idea.
Went through numbers,
that's very, very interesting, yeah.
But does that come from sort of like a sense of malaise, like a lack of social confidence?
For them?
No, sort of like in the West and sort of like in those Asian countries, like that the only people who have maybe this sort of sense of vitality or can taste victory are these sort of Islamic minorities.
Yeah, or like religious zealots who are able to sacrifice their individualism for the group.
Yeah. That's why I think it's great to restore a conversation between the generations, between my generation and your generation and Gen Z and so on, as to, first of all, you get to inherit this society. Like, we are fading. We meaning my, not you.
Don't say that. You're not fading yet. Oh God, he's like something from Lord of the Rings. Though.
The two of you, obviously, and what comes in your children and my children. That's the future, and so that's why you have to have these conversations about what are the mistakes that my generation made. What is an honest autopsy of the sexual revolution? Because for a lot of people from my generation, you can't say anything remotely negative about the sexual revolution. You will be hounded out of the room if you come out saying, women should be having children and women should consider staying at home to raise those children. I mean, I can hear the noises. I'm actually shaking just thinking about the sorts of reactions we'll get. But coming onto your generation and beyond, I think that it's healthier if you say, we are not going to live in denial. We are going to do an autopsy of, as you have been doing with some of your autopsy of the sexual revolution, and we are actually going to confront you with the very negative consequences of that for women as individuals, for the family, for society in general. And I'm prepared not only to hear them, but to give it a platform and tell women in their 50s and in their 60s, may have been great for you, but it's not so great for the rest of,
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how anybody could, in their right mind, like sit there and deny the fact that it's like objectively true and totally observable that any new like social technology that comes packaged with an ideology will have like both good and bad elements mixed in.
It makes sense to me. It makes sense to you because you're being very, very rational. But the whole thing is, we live in an emotional, and I call it an democracy, a society now where emotions are paramount. It's how you feel and what you feel. And the narcissism you spoke about when we were talking about these protesters, it's because of this elevation of feelings beyond and above everything else. And for Islamists, it's actually the opposite. It is the constraint and the restraint of emotion. It's the complete denial of emotion because you sacrifice yourself for something higher and above you, and more powerful than you. And then if you look at if you go back to great power, authoritarianism, and that it goes back to these reason-centered ways of dominating the world, while our society is all about how you feel and how do you feel about the sexual revolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Islamists are like transhumanists weirdly in that way, because they're not aware, they're in denial about the fact that they too are governed by emotions. But like transhumanists, I guess they have an essentially transcendent mission, whether we like it or not.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw you had that Brian Johnson on recently, and you were quizzing him about his wanting to live forever and all these sorts of things.
Yeah. But the feelings thing is that if you ask, can we meditate on the plus minus, the rational approach? How do you evaluate the sexual revolution, or how do you evaluate the technology like the pill and that? That's a perfectly reasonable, rational question, and you come out on, there are pluses and the minuses. But it's never posed, it's always how do you feel? And then you get people's emotions. And
I do think that is a legacy of feminism, the negative one, because I think
it's a legacy of my age mates.
Yeah.
So 50 plus women, 60 plus women feel that they had suffered in ways that the younger generations have not suffered. They feel the younger generations just got everything, like you were saying, ladled into their mouths, and they never had to do anything for anything. How dare they question us? And I think that is, I respect the women who had to burn their bras, and, who really fought for us all, and then the generation before that, for us to get the vote, to get access to education, to be treated like real human beings. There is a real story of emancipation there. But that story of emancipation cannot then eat itself up by leaving nothing for the rest, not leaving anything for subsequent generations.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, obviously, like, we're all feminists here. We don't want to go back to the way things were in, like, medieval Somalia or medieval Armenia.
Or medieval America.
Or medieval America, but there's, like, which was what, Native American? But
no, so not sort of in the time period, but, when American women were not allowed to vote, and when, your husband owned you, and you were trapped, and, we don't want to go back to that time.
Anna, I'm curious, what do you think about the sort of what it does to like the female psyche, like when women sort of emerge, enter this sort of stage of liberation or whatever, and then begin entering male spaces, and those male spaces end up maybe changing slightly to accommodate the women who are there, or like you've spoken about sort of women in the red pill movement, for example, breaking into a male-dominated space because they have a sort of unique position in that sort of area.
Yeah, because they're women and they're hot and sexy, and so they're titillating to the men in that space. But then, and they understand this because they're there primarily for money and attention, probably in the other order, and they are at least like on a subliminal level aware of what they're doing, and then they come into these spaces, they kind of insert themselves or inflict themselves into those spaces, and then they get upset when they're not treated as equals, which I think they absolutely are. I actually think that women, when they are finally treated as equals, often find that they can't tolerate it and would prefer, again, to have special perks and concessions.
Right.
Because
if they get treated the way men treat other men.
Which is the
same tone.
Which is rude and competitive. But actually kind of, strangely neutral and not like ridden or saddled with malice.
There's like a fraternal aspect to that,
but it's not a polite society. And I think when women are confronted with a society that is basically impolite, incivil, they start to short circuit, they take it personally. And so you have to be aware of that as a woman when you go into one of those spaces. Of course, all the insults in those spaces are tailored toward your sex. Like they'll call you ugly or send you empty egg cartons. They know how to specifically ding the pride of women, but I don't think it's personal.
Fair enough. And then I suppose you mentioned obviously motherhood.
Yeah.
And you have Lenny, your kid. I guess he's a toddler now, right?
He just turned 3.
Just turned 3.
Yeah.
Do you think that your perspective on a lot of these issues, social issues, women, feminism, like drastically changed when you started raising him?
No, I can't say it did, because I never thought one way or another about it.
Yeah.
I will say one of my issues with the discourse on motherhood now is that the kind of de facto spokespersons have typically become mothers later on in life, in you know, like myself, in keeping with the general fertility trends among you know, middle class educated Western women, and so their experience, they have a very personalized view of it because their experience was kind of a novelty. It was a personal novelty to have a child after everything was said and done, and they probably never thought they would or didn't even want one, and that sort of thing. And so a lot of times they treat it as like a kind of epiphany.
Right, okay.
And almost launch like a crusade against their former youthful selves who were like leftist and anti-natalist and like living in a punk house or focusing too much on their career.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of radical about face that I'm just very suspicious of in people in general, because it's almost like a kind of seeker activity.
Yeah.
I find it...
I have this sort of same criticism sometimes. We've spoken about it, where you go to endless ones of these conferences and you have those people who were former Trotskyists or former sort of communists, and then they went away, they huddled themselves away and read all of the texts, and then they came round to this idea like various normal conservative ideas, which some people arrived at from first principles. So this like revolutionary sort of deep intelligence that they had to discover.
It becomes like an identity or personality, which, you know, is fine and good. I'm like very happy for them.
Yeah.
Because I think they ultimately like made the right decision, did the right thing. But I think like throughout human history, motherhood again was simply a fact of life. It did not occur to most people.
No.
And so the picture that they present of motherhood is a very narrow one.
It's a luxury one too.
Yeah.
Because that's not how it is for most women.
And so it feels a lot like a LARP. I mean, I think the religious analogy is a good one because I think some form of doubt has always been permitted in all like Judeo-Christian religious models. But now especially it feels like, very often feels like a LARP among these people who have experienced like a mini surge of religion, because you know, it's very hard as a modern secular person to suspend disbelief and believe in something. And I say this as a person who's like God-fearing, who prays every day, but who was never raised in any kind of
religion.
I didn't know that. I didn't know you prayed every day.
I'm like,
you are sort of
super,
like woman of So you have some faith. Some in the abstract.
I do, but it's very hard for me. Like, I find it very inspiring and interesting that you turn to Christianity. Like Dasha, my podcasting partner.
That's been really interesting to hear that whole journey.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, she's essentially a cradle Catholic. She was born Catholic, but only recently has she taken up the faith again. And like, to me, that's like very admirable and aspirational, but I struggle with it myself because I'm like, okay, like how do I force myself to believe in a church, in one church, you know? It's easy to believe in one God. It's very hard to believe in one church.
Choose a denomination. I think that is.
How are you finding that? How are you finding that whole experience? Because obviously you, like you said yesterday with Richard Dawkins, you had this sort of moment where you chose something rather than nothing, which I like that formulation. But obviously, like you admitted, you're sort of still sort of figuring it out, like what that really means. You're reading the Bible, you're looking at the texts, and you're sort of on this journey. And I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it very much. I feel, like I said yesterday, the other day, feel very alive and connected, and
and all that. But of course, I have moments of doubt, grave doubts, and I totally understand if you grew up in a modern, secular, academic home, that to say that you not only believe in something you can't prove is there, but also, choose a denomination or a church or do that kind of belonging is not something fashionable. It's not something of modern times. I totally understand that. I get that but what I see, apart from myself, is more and more people, and it's weird. It's like when you come out and you say, "Hey, this sort of thing has been happening to me." More and more people, I've had the same experience too. I've got the same, and I don't know. Maybe we'll see churches like that emerging. I go to a church that's very accepting and that doesn't quiz me about where I am or my background or any of that. Just says welcome and sit down and hands me the hymn book and the program. And
I mean, I'm a big proponent of like fake it till you make it in general. I think that's a very productive, constructive approach to life.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I have great suspicion of people who come to something, fully fledged, with everything worked out. They know all the rules, they know all the laws, they know the whole theology or whatever we're talking about. Yeah. So,
in a way, it's richer and more meaningful than if you've just been pushed into it as a child. You were baptized and you were told, "Here, you are this now." And you identify as that, and you never bother to really look into what it is about.
But that is also the flip side of what I said about coming to motherhood later on in life, right? Because you're older and wiser, more self-aware, more conscious of like the gift, the honor of having a child. I can't imagine, feeling that way if you're like, a 16-year-old mom or a 19-year-old mom.
Yeah. I think, I don't know, I just feel this sense that because of all these conversations that are, I think because of the opening now of independent media, there is a democratization of information and the exchange of ideas, and that makes me feel very, very optimistic. I want to go back to the whole... the feminist women's attitude. I wrote this article called Fuzzy Rape. And the background to that was, of course, there was the whole Me Too thing, where I find women collectively excited about a violation of some women's rights that are a violation to be condemned. But compared to the violations, sexual violence, sexual assault, it's absolutely horrific. And then this double standard, where, okay, if you work in Hollywood and you happen to be victimized by Harvey Weinstein, we have a movement for you. But if you are gang raped, by immigrant men that have been placed in your neighborhood, we will pretend that you don't exist and your problems don't exist.
It's racist and Islamophobic to notice.
Racist and Islamophobic. And I think the other one that really comes to mind, because this is happening after Me Too, is October 7 and what happened to those women, Israeli women, some of them American women. They came from different places in the world. These women were assaulted and they were subjected to crimes and dehumanization so brutal that none of us can imagine it, but it happened. And yet, I have to ask myself, where the hell is Me Too? Where are the women who are, in Washington, D.C. with their pussy hats? Going against Trump. What the heck is going on? That makes me very, very angry. And I'd written a book called Pray about what was going on in Europe and the effect of the unintended consequences of immigration on the rights of women on this type of violence. And it is, okay, so you get a whole movement, to throw one guy in jail. How many people went to prison because of Me Too?
A handful.
A handful, and this.
But they're all sort of elites. This is like an elite movement.
It's elite, and these experienced women, they found themselves in trouble, and what happened to them is unjustifiable and should never have happened. But why are we not? Where's Oprah Winfrey? Where are all these famous women who told us now, take to the streets, your rights are over? Like, what is going on with us? I have to make an exception for Sheryl Sandberg, who has gone to Israel and has made a documentary about that, and is willing to confront the world with, here are the horrors of what happened.
Yeah, well...
But where's the rest of us?
I mean, I think...
Yeah.
I think kind of Jewish liberal feminists who traditionally vote Democrat and support progressive causes are really not having a normal one right now, because they're kind of realizing that they don't fall under the kind of special protections awarded women as a group and actually really want them. And there's the whole interesting new situation with Jews in America especially. But I think, like, in general, Me Too was remember at the start of Me Too, there was a really big Time magazine headline that was like, 700,000 agriculture workers stand with Hollywood actresses on Me Too. And I remember like thinking like, no, like other way around. And I don't know. I have a lot of takes about Me Too. I think like on a superficial level, it was a justice movement that was seeking to get justice for victims of like rape and sexual assault. On kind of a secondary, deeper level, it was a power grab that tried to realign basically the kind of demographics, or tried to kind of achieve jobs for people by kind of a demographic shift, by privileging women over men, that sort of thing. And then I think at its core, the real psychological mechanism of Me Too, it was not that it was anger, it was rage, but it was not anger and rage over male hostility and aggression. It was anger and rage about male indifference. And impotence. I think that's really what Me Too was, in a kind of symbolic sense. It was a provocation to men to take a firm hand.
But it was counterproductive then, if I do,
Yeah, because I think like all activism, it came after some kind of major technological change, in this case probably the pill, and instead of kind of marshaling itself against it, it marched in lockstep while pretending to rebel. I think that's the case with most big activist movements, if you actually look into them and see what they're all about. But yeah, I think it's led to the further emasculation of men.
Yeah, which maybe doesn't serve the female population.
No, not
I guess
at all.
Are you sort of saying that actually it wasn't about rescuing women from the sort of most violent men in society, but there's this, I think Louise Perry talks about this sort of like grey, this sort of intermediate area where we've lost the sort of moral framework for condemning men who just behave badly, but they're not like rapists or murderers or sexually violent. They're just sort of cads,
they're rakes or cads or like players, whatever.
Cads.
And there's like, I suppose, like resentment that comes with being spurned or being scorned, or having to sort of see men making the most of the benefits of the sexual revolution for themselves.
Or accused of toxic masculinity and demonized in that way. And the whole idea of chivalry and dignity, which used to have to a society that insists on chivalry, demands that men behave in a certain way and that they're protective towards women. And so that was cleaned out of the way by saying, no, we don't want men to do that. So a man opening the door for you, a small gesture.
It's a microaggression.
It was a microaggression, and they were accused of all of these terrible things that they weren't doing, leaving men then in this no man's land of not knowing how to behave around women. And I think Me Too actually exacerbated that problem.
Yeah, because women really resent when men are non-committal and indecisive. It's infuriating.
You made them non-committal and indecisive.
Yeah, and I think women resent that we have the power to make them that way, because ostensibly men should be kind of more stoic, stronger, better at leadership than we are. And I think this is another case where feminism sued for some sort of equality, got more than it bargained for, got buyer's remorse, and now there's nothing left to do but to have women take responsibility for the situation, unfortunately.
And maybe go back, and here's the restoration part of it, is restore a relationship with men that is, let's go back to the healthy dignity, chivalry, call out cads. Call them out. But don't call what a cad does rape when it is, whistling and, behaving in this unattractive way. But it's not a crime.
But actually make serious demands of men.
And make serious demands of men. You say, but we have the sexual violence, actual violence has to stop. And so I think that is one way of going about rediscovering a new relationship with men, but one of friendship and alliance, and not that they are toxic and we have to invade their spaces. It's always like the last headline was in the UK, I think, where there's this demand that women, there are no women trained drivers. I mean, just irrational, crazy stuff like that. That's a sort of the remnants of the feminism of my generation.
Yeah, I mean, there was that famous study that everyone always cites that compared like Scandinavia and Iran. And actually, in societies that have more equality, more parity between the sexes, women choose to pursue more traditionally feminine domestic roles.
Yeah.
Whereas in Iran, they're all like STEM majors or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think, again, nobody saw that one. None of the social scientists saw that one coming, and we had to really readjust our expectations. But no one, I don't think we're at a point, we're getting there, but I don't think we're at a point where people are willing to acknowledge that, kind of on a mainstream mass level, that this is the result of biological sex differences and not a social construct.
Yeah. And on the biological difference, I mean, I think it's wonderful to be a woman. You don't have to think. It's wonderful and interesting, and
you can get away with anything.
Much more interesting than being male, I think.
I don't know. There's pros. There's pros to it. Anna, I wanted to ask you just about some of these social movements more broadly. You're a big fan of Quentin Crisp, and I'll quote him now. Actually, he said, "Politics are not an instrument for affecting social change. They're the art of making the inevitable appear to be a matter of wise human choice." All of these movements, BLM, Me Too, student protests, do you think they're sort of goaded on by just grander forces in history? Or do you think we really, people can control the zeitgeist?
I mean, I think in the case of progressive protest movements, a lot of them are actually just astroturfed to look grassroots. I have a friend called Amber Lee Frost. She's a co-host on Chapo Trap House. She recently wrote a kind of like a political memoir of her coming of age as a leftist. And in it, she profiles this guy, Malcolm Harris, who I don't know if you remember, is I think he was like an N+1 editor and a leftist organizer. And he ended up starting a boutique consulting agency that helped NGOs and activists make their protests, make their activism look kind of more organic than it really was. So I think there's that. But also a lot of these movements like Me Too, like BLM, come about at a time, again, when all the original kind of oppression and discrimination has basically has disappeared, evaporated. Yeah. Me Too came about at a time when I would bet that sexual violence among kind of, again, like middle-class educated Western people.
Hollywood
women was at an all-time low. I think BLM happened at a time when white racism against blacks it's a virtually non-existent form in America. I think it's probably, I'm sure some hate crimes occur that are not enough to even
there was an
sample size.
I met my husband in New York. It was a huge change. I came here in 2006, and I can't describe just the sheer number of places I go to that are completely racially mixed.
Yeah.
And we took it so for granted. No one talks about about skincare or skin color until Obama came president. And I don't know if that's an unintended consequence. I found Obama's leadership in, leading up to the racial healing that was expected. I think he failed that. I think his administration failed in that. And then I think, these identity groups came up and flourished and started to talk about a phantom problem.
I mean, I think with Obama, it was absolutely intentional. And it was an attempt to keep together what Saylor has called like the coalition of the fringes or the coalition of the margins, the random assorted demographics that make up the Democratic constituency, which are like, millennials and women and Jews and black church ladies and gay guys and all these people who basically, like, if you put them in a room together, would really hate each other.
And they have nothing in common.
They have nothing in common. And so they have to be rallied around hatred of the kind of great white man, the great white male defendant, which is also like a phantom thing that doesn't exist anymore.
No, it is actually the opposite, because if you look at the demographics everywhere, in the middle of the country, you look at other European countries, white boys dropping out of school, have no role models, are falling into crime, make very low incomes, and this whole notion of the white heterosexual male being the grand oppressor is not empirically, it's something that can easily be challenged. And it's also very, very dangerous, because you see in places like East Germany now, there were always sort of remnants of white supremacists who adored Hitler and Nazism. And now they have actually a reason to say that there's real persecution of white men and white-skinned people. And so you've given them a cause now. It's quite dangerous, I think, this whole identity politics.
Yeah, you actually end up like ratcheting up the kind of latent natural frictions that already exist. And that, again, I always really loved growing up in America because I thought it was so diverse and so colorblind. And there were always like racial incidents during my youth. I mean, first of all, there was O.J. Simpson. There was the Crown Heights riots. There was like Tawana Brawley. There was Abner Louima and that kind of stuff. Amadou Diallo. But for the most part, the relations were like stabilized and contained. But I think like you find that like Me Too and BLM, these kind of movements come about or become especially like vocal and aggressive when the problems that they're supposedly fighting have already been solved, have already been accounted for, and there's a great incentive to manufacture ever more like elaborate and confected theories of systemic oppression of marginalized groups like women and blacks.
Yeah. I think it's interesting what you said, that the Democratic Party is all about keeping these margins together.
Yes.
And that you have to then invent a problem.
This is Douglas's Douglas Murray's sort of metaphor of George slaying the dragon. You know, he sort of goes around and finds sort of ever increasing demons to sort of try and tackle, but it's sort of futile.
Yeah.
And frankly, I have to say respect, because they did a great job. They were very inventive.
Yeah, they were. They have been. It's I suppose it's kind of crazy. I suppose the one thing I just also wanted to ask was about the Russian psyche. You're obviously Russian. Your co-host has.
I don't think so. Obviously.
Oh no!
Not so obviously.
Well, we just spoke. Yeah, we've spoken about it, and obviously, like, it means a lot to you. Dmitry Levitin recently wrote a piece in the Critic magazine, basically taking apart the Putin's sort of narrative for Russia that he gave on the Tucker interview, and he claimed that sort of, like, the overarching condition in Russian society, the overarching mentality was one of paranoia, which leads to sort of preemptive aggression. I'm thinking particularly with the war in Ukraine. I wonder how much you sort of like would recognize that as a...
I don't know if that's true now. I mean, you have to keep in mind I haven't been back to Russia in like 33 years or something like that. So I can't really comment on the psyche of your average Russian. But I certainly there's some truth to it, because it is the psyche of your average Russian, of Russian culture in general, under Stalinism first, and then under privatization. I am sympathetic to the theory that the few decades of privatization after the Berlin Wall fell probably inflicted as much, if not more, damage on Russians than living under communism for 70 years. But yeah, I mean, it's true that we are a somewhat paranoid and cynical people. Even as a person who like thinks of themselves basically as an American, I have to struggle with this within myself, because, you know, my view of the world is just so harsh and ruthless.
Right.
Wow.
And I think it served me a lot, because it again gives you a distance, allows you to like notice things that other people probably wouldn't or would deny. But it's like the difference between Russian and American school children, which I can confirm anecdotally, having been like a young Russian school child transplanted into the American school system, is that when American teachers ask a question, the hands always shoot up. And I was always the kid who did not want to raise my hand, did not want to stand up to sing the national anthem, not because I was like angry or resentful, but because the thought of identifying myself was frightening to me.
Right.
And that's like a hand-me-down from my parents and my grandparents. Like, I have no reason, no cause to feel that way, but they did. And, you know, that I think that's probably like my fundamental disagreement with like American leftists and American social justice movements. Why on earth would you want to identify yourself or label yourself?
So you think Americans have this sort of fondness to wear their, you know, to wear their identities on their sleeve?
Yeah, they're mad.
Which is just it's the thing that's completely foreign to me.
Yeah. I think there's like an European sort of intermediate sense whereby like when you come over to America, it's sort of very in your face, and you realize I have to sort of promote my various identities. Whereas in Europe, I mean, people don't want to hear it, really.
So I lived for 14 years in the Netherlands, and it is, I don't want to say it's like Russia. It's not. They didn't have to deal with the Soviet Union in that level of suppression, but they were reckoning with what they did to the Jews in the 30s and the lead up to Hitler's terrible wake. And so there is this downplaying of race, skin color, identity. People just, or actually sometimes apologizing for it. I'm not, they'll say, I don't care about, I'm not a nationalist, I'm not patriotic at all, I don't care about the national anthem. You know, I the royal family, and I'm a Republican. So there's a lot of that. I don't have anything to do with this. I love you. I love black people. And it's like, oh, it's okay. You don't really care.
Anna, I just also wanted to ask about art. Whether there is such thing as right-wing art, whether there can be such thing as right-wing art, and with the upcoming election potentially of Donald Trump, how you view him? Do you view him as a sort of like an aesthetic or artistic phenomenon?
Yeah.
Is that a fair
I've heard you. You've spoken about it quite a lot on the podcast, so I'm just.
Yeah, I mean, no, sorry, I just touched my microphone. I think like the obvious answer about whether there will ever be like a good conservative or right-wing art is no, because they're overly ideologically possessed and they're overly moralistic to the point of being moralizing, and that is the enemy of creativity. When you try to shoehorn your moral frame and your ideological convictions into works of art, it typically doesn't work very well, it doesn't translate well to the form. I think that in order to be a good artist, you have to be maybe not immoral, but somewhat amoral, in the sense that you have to be willing to accept reality for what it is versus what you would like it to be or want it to be. But on the other hand, a lot of the best artists, in my opinion, who are working today are basically conservative or right-wing in scare quotes. Certainly they're not liberal. I'm thinking of people like, for instance, Michelle Houellebecq, Bret Easton Ellis, Nick Pizzolatto, Mike White, Morrissey, who's my favorite music artist, Lana Del Rey, who's probably the best songwriter we have after Morrissey. She's constantly, depending on where you stand, she's constantly being accused of or praised for inserting right-wing dog whistles into her lyrics and social media posts, even though there's like literally no evidence for that. And then, on the other hand, I think about my favorite artists from the past. It's, people like Pier Paolo Pasolini or Alberto Moravia, who were avowed left. They were members of the Communist Party, or guys like my two favorite directors, Joseph Losey, who was chased out of Hollywood by the McCarthyites and went on to have a very successful career in London with Harold Pinter, or Carlos Suara, who just died, and he was very famously an anti-fascist who was repressed by the Franco regime. So I don't know, it's hard to say. I think like probably in order to be a good artist, you can't be overly political. I think Kathleen Stock, who I just did a panel with, has basically, she wrote two very good articles on Houellebecq and on Lana, where she essentially praised them for being good, neutral observers of the reality as it is, like, especially when it comes to something like sex and gender. And I think just being a kind of neutral observer of reality already sets you up for being billed as like right-wing or conservative.
So do you think Alana gets criticized not necessarily because she says anything particularly conservative, but she just is unashamed to be American, unashamed to be a woman, unashamed to be
like it doesn't occur.
I think she's not woke.
Comes into her art.
Yeah, she's not woke, and I think at this point probably she's caught wind of the fact that this is like a controversy swirling around her, and has like adjusted her marketing or whatever. But I don't know. I mean, it seems like there can actually be like good art that's basically right wing to the extent that it's not left wing.
Right.
Yeah.
And as for Trump, I mean, I don't know. I don't have anything profound or illuminating to say. I think he's a great artistic and communications genius.
Right, yeah.
I love that because everybody is expected to say something profound about Donald Trump when he is the most talked about human being since at least 2015. And so I don't know if there's anything left. Every time I think there's nothing left to say about Trump. You find the headlines full of Trump. So.
Yeah, there really isn't.
And did you want to ask if there was
yes.
one thing that you could do?
One thing, yes. That is, so this is the Restoration Bulletin and the Restoration Podcast. And I want to end by asking every guest, if you had a magic wand, if you had the power to change or restore anything, what would you restore? The one thing you would restore?
That's also a good question. I want 3 wishes: like get rid of feminism, get rid of BLM, and no. But I think if it could be one thing, I would probably have to go with a restoration of religious faith, even though I myself am not a particularly religious person, because I think that once you lose faith, it's very hard to restore it. And I think like that ship has sailed. We're past that point. And that was probably the single most institution that gave the vast majority of people meaning and purpose.
Thank you very, very, very much. I think that's a very profound answer.
I don't know about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And that's coming from you to younger audiences. I think that's quite meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. I'm glad we got to talk about it already, just a little bit.
Yeah.